Welcome to another episode of the Performance Strategies and Stumbles podcast with me, your host Dan Howells, where we go on a unique journey of back-to-back week episodes with one guest talking about a specific strategy in week one and a specific episode dedicated to mistakes and stumbles in week two. Today we have Dr. Steven Thompson joining us, who is a specialist in the use of velocity-based training. So without further ado, let's head straight to the episode with Steven. I've got Dr. Steve Thompson with me today. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hi Dan, thanks very much for inviting me on.
Yeah, it's great to have you. So we're going to be speaking about a very specific performance strategy in this first half of the episode before we get onto your stumbles in your career. Yep. So just talk to the listeners here, share a little bit about what we're going to be talking about, what strategy.
So we're going to talk about VBT, so velocity-based training, an area of real interest of mine, something that I've studied for a long time. My PhD was part of that that area. Yeah. And it's something that I incorporate a lot in the coaching that I do. So we're going to touch on a few different aspects within VBT today.
Great. And I guess for you, the number one reason that you're using it is a form of communication between you and the athlete, right?
Yeah, it's multifaceted, really. There's lots of reasons. Feedback and communication and kind of intent driving is definitely one of them. For me, the main reason I use VBT is because it provides me with a flexible programming strategy. Nice. It allows me to auto-regulate. It allows me to listen to what the person in front of me is saying on that given day and deviate from whatever roadmap we've already planned out previous, whether that's a micro, meso, macro cycle, and allows us to be flexible in the way that we program.
Nice.
I fully believe VBT is a complementary strategy. So I'm not one of those people that kind of thinks VBT is the be all and end all. It should complement some of those traditional methods that we already use, i.e. periodization. I think it's very much founded around that. But without that flexible programming, I feel like periodization doesn't do enough to take into account the kind of the physiological, the psychological sort of status of the athletes that walk in the door on any given day.
Nice. And I just had a reflection of a tweet or something I saw online recently about why does VBT, why does RP, reps and reserve all exist? Well, it exists because there is a biological response to a stimulus that's different between individuals, and therefore percentage-based lifts as such aren't going to work in a very, ecologically dynamic team environment or athlete environment, which is probably most athletes, aside from maybe a weightlifting sport in itself, where percentage-based will come into play a little bit more. Yeah. That's awesome. So we're going to dig into three specific strategies here. And what I'm really excited about for everyone listening is that all this can be done without even profiling an athlete using VBT. And I think everybody sometimes falls into the trap of I've got to characterize things, I've got to assess somebody first before I can use VBT, which is incorrect. So just share some of the areas we're going to dig into today specifically.
Yeah, of course. I think it's important to kind of preface that with, there's a spectrum of VBT applications. VBT is an umbrella term. And within that sits a number of different approaches that are multifaceted and flexible. And the most immersive is your profiling and your full-on programming with VBT involved. And that's a great option. But often than not, and certainly some of the research that I've done, coaches, athletes, they don't feel like they have the time to go that immersive. And because of that, I think there are some simple solutions to still being able to auto-regulate, to still being able to utilize VBT and get the best out of your athletes on any given day. So the three areas that I typically focus on that requires no of that preamble profiling is some simple monitoring, simple feedback mechanisms and approaches, and then velocity loss, which kind of links to volume control. So from a monitoring strategy, from a readiness to train or from an adaptation perspective, VBT can be a really valuable tool. So we can utilize VBT to identify manifestation of fatigue or improvements in performance and physiological adaptations from a strength, power, conditioning perspective. And the reason I like VBT, the reason why I like velocity is because it has a direct neuromuscular function. When we break down mechanisms, when we break down kind of the mechanical principles of human movement, often we are left with force and velocity. Now, if we can measure one of those relatively simply, that has a direct link to our physiological mechanisms and the way that we produce force and the way that we adapt, then I think we're much closer to really understanding what's happening under the hood than if we're taking something like jump height, like readiness to train questionnaires. Not that there isn't a place for that stuff, and not that force plates don't give you a whole host of information, and actually, these days they're quite accessible. You've got some really good companies out there that provide really easy to use and get and extract easy sort of useful data. But I think from my perspective, if we measure barbell velocity, that's going to directly link into the session we're about to do. So we can do some real simple stuff like, for example, we might bring our athletes in and we might do 5 unweighted jumps with a dowel or with a 20k bar, measure peak or mean velocity, and just simply track that over time. And all that does is allows us to monitor that output on a regular basis. And if we see any dips, any sort of dips that we're concerned about, and we can threshold it if we want, we can say 10%, 15%, 20%. Yeah. But if we see any noticeable dips in that data, all that does is sparks a really useful conversation. Now, I'm not the sort of person that advocates if you dip by 20%, you must change your program by X, because it just doesn't work like that. But what it does do is it flags up some issue physiologically and physically that you as the coach can then go and explore further. And I think it's a really powerful tool.
So this looks like you're monitoring the freshness over fatigue presence in an athlete's current athlete status. You're using it as a tool that I guess will drive a little bit of competition between athletes in a given environment, which will probably add to the validity of the information you're collecting. But essentially, you're collecting that information and really happy to adapt, push and pull based on what you see in front of you. So let's say we do have a situation then with your athletes who come in and they've gone the other way. They're really positive. That's a positive adaptation potentially. Are you sticking to process in that case with your program, or are you going, wow, okay, there's an opportunity to chase something more here? What happens at that end of the data?
Great question, and I don't see why not. I think all of this information that we're collecting just adds to the overall equation of what we're trying to do as S&C coaches, and that is improve someone's performance, whatever way we choose to try and do that. So if there's a day where we come in and suddenly those velocities have increased by 20%, again, I'll have that conversation. Are you feeling good? Yeah. Do you want to chase a bit today? Should we try and push you on a little bit today and see if we can get some new incremental loads, see if we can get some new PBs, see if we can get some new velocities on similar loads? And all of that dictates to evidence that our interventions are working and that our athletes are getting better. And I think one of the key things that I see missing in a lot of programs when it comes to strength testing is that submaximal load and standardized load and measuring velocity. If we boil it right back to Newton's laws of force equals mass times acceleration, if we know that mass is fixed and we increase acceleration, therefore force has to go up. We know that force is a byproduct of strength, and therefore we can say this person has got stronger because they're moving the same mass quicker. Yeah. And all that does for me is it provides a solution to those people, those teams, those coaches that perhaps don't like taking their athletes up to 1RM for whatever reason. And they're all legitimate reasons. I still very much support 1RM testing. I think it has a place, but there's plenty of times and plenty of environments where it just doesn't fit. And I think this is definitely a halfway house for that.
Does this come into the feedback element with the athletes?
I think it's probably not sectioned off in that way. I think it links into that a little bit. I would bracket this in with my testing and my monitoring. So if I was going to do pre-post testing, for example, I might do it that way if I couldn't do 1RMs or I couldn't do a full profile. But then also, you're still getting, if you use VBT properly, you're going to get regular data from every session in key lifts. So you can still track change over time in many different ways that is much more holistic than that you're going to test today.
So in your monitoring bucket, you've got not only this classic pre-session jump neuromuscular assessment, where are they in the freshness fatigue scale, you're also carrying that principle of monitoring through to a session by the sounds of it.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we go back to the pre-session, just for the listeners then, if you do have somebody who's trended down, maybe out of what would be expected, something abnormal's happened and you've got this suppression of physical qualities and you have this drop below a threshold that you see as a bandwidth of normal for them. What's your go-to approach from that point on? What are you modulating, accommodating in that instance?
So as I mentioned, first thing, have the conversation. Why has this happened? What are we owing it to? Has it been a tough week? Has there been excessive sessions? Have there been hard sessions? Have they had crap sleep? Have they not eaten well? Are they feeling ill? And I think that information then feeds into the next sort of chain of decisions in terms of what we're going to change. If then we get to that point where we are going to change, I would think about the block of training that I'm in. Am I trying to get after volume? Am I trying to get after intensity? I think typically, and from my own anecdotal experience with athletes, they can manage intensity better than they can manage volume. And actually pushing intensity, not adapting intensity, but stripping out sets often renders a slightly better feeling at the end of the session than if we brought things down but still look to work to the same volumes. And also, if we get into that first working set and that load is feeling it's moving really slow and that athlete is thinking, I haven't got this in me, then maybe we pull that back a little bit as well. But it's very iterative. It's very much right. Let's use our feel. Let's use our coach's eye. Let's use our conversations with the athlete to try and figure that out as a team, as opposed to me just saying, right, this is what you're doing.
Nice. And I think that resonates with me, where I've used VBT in the moment before, where we've seen quite early in the session from a monitoring point of view that this doesn't track with what's expected for this athlete in the context of the world or the situation we're in. We're in a training camp. It's not excessively high volume. We'll have a conversation. There's nothing untoward that the athlete thinks has gone on differently. But we go, do you know what? I'm going to retain intensity and strip back volume in a mini taper approach or a deload approach, and just see what the response is from that.
Yeah.
You talked about the Newtonian laws and if we can move the same mass for an increased velocity, we can assume that somebody's got stronger. And I think that's almost one of the simplest ways to use VBT that's often not honed in on in actual training sets. So how are you doing that? And is it just simply a great awareness from you in terms of knowing your athlete's norms? Because I look back to my time in baseball, it was brilliant to show guys pulling a certain amount of weight off the floor at 0.2 meters per second greater than they were 2 months ago. I haven't had to 1RM at all. I can show them that there's a positive adaptation there. So how does that come to life practically for you?
Yeah, so I think I would probably approach it in two separate ways. I would do the more official, right, I'm going to pick a load that's appropriate for this individual, an absolute load, whether that's 60, 80, 100, 150, whatever their strength levels are. Perhaps maybe looking, if we're going to try and link it to a percentage of 1RM, maybe something around the 80%, because I feel like 80% is a nice load for people to lift. It's something to push against if we're talking a squat or whatever. But it's not too heavy that it's really going to cause much fatigue if we're going to do single reps. But I would still pick an arbitrary kind of absolute load, and I would track that pre-post intervention or pre-mid-post intervention to make sure that things are moving in the right direction. But then I would do it a little bit more unofficially, where I am just simply tracking loads at given key exercises for given set ranges. And you kind of, if you then plot that on a graph over time, you will see trends. You'll naturally see the trends in the velocity, whether you take average set velocities across however many reps, or you take max velocity from each set from a given day, or you do something in between. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer. It's whatever fits with your kind of ideas.
I think that's useful for the listeners to hear, because I think people associate data with a rigid process of collection. And actually, it's the execution that's the rigid process. And actually, you can essentially have movement speeds at 80 kg, movement speeds at 60, and you can still, because of the linear relationship of VBT or velocity and load, you can still work out whether there's an adaptation from doing two different things, essentially, right? And 100%. I think that's probably, it's useful to give the listeners comfort that the monitoring is that. Monitoring is training, training is monitoring. It's not testing. It's not defining success or failure here. So collect the information, the insights, and I guess go back and retrospectively look at it.
Yeah.
So we're going to get into other areas here like feedback and velocity loss. We have touched on feedback somewhat, but more specifically, how do you use it for feedback?
So feedback is a great plug and play type option for VBT. It allows you to create intent in movement within an individual, create competition within that individual, so kind of intra-person competition, but then you can create really great environments within team settings where there's leaderboards, there's competitive streaks, and there's competitive kind of almost like gamification, I suppose, of training in a sense. And we all know how competitive athletes are. So I found in the settings that I've used it in, it to be really, really beneficial to create healthy competition. And it's great for buy-in. It creates so much buy-in, working in football for many years as I have. Certainly with younger athletes, notoriously then they don't want to lift heavy loads, or some of them don't. Some of them do. Some of them get high and they love it. Others don't. And I think if you flip the focus on, all right, I'm not so worried about what's on the bar, but I'm worried about you moving this fast, and you give them a different focus, a different target, I found that they kind of buy into it a lot better. And that link between moving fast in the gym versus moving fast on the field or on the court or whatever it is computes a lot better with individuals, athletes, than moving heavy in the gym and slow is going to translate into fast, which we know doesn't always cross over anyway. So feedback is great for just buy-in, competition, moving with intent, and just, what's your number, right? 1.2. Can we move it faster? 1.22. Can we get 1.24? Just giving that constant feedback. And there's research out there that suggests there's a really cool review from Jonathan Weekly, who looks at all different types of feedback mechanisms and finds that any feedback is better than no feedback. It improves performance acutely and chronically. And then if we actually give visual feedback over verbal feedback, that pushes it on and improves it a little bit more as well. So it's such a strong tool that, again, maybe doesn't get used that much, maybe doesn't get used in the right way within our field as good as it could do, as opposed to, the typical verbal encouragement of go on, move it faster, keep pushing, that kind of stuff that, once you've said it a few times, athletes probably just tune it out. And this is tangible information. Yeah,
it sounds like with all feedback, it's probably more powerful when related to education and understanding as well for the athlete.
Yeah.
And so I thought, look, you plowed out some numbers there. I'd really love to dive into that before we get into velocity loss, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of people seem to get lost in this binary like threshold of 0.5, 0.6, 0.7, 0.8, etc. From my experience, and I'd love for you to critique me on this, I actually try and move out the middle zones a little bit, because athletes seem to get confused in that space. And if I'm looking to use it for feedback, I want to make sure that they understand exactly what it is. So, I work in that, 1.2 is my sort of speed strength side of things, as explosive as possible. 0.8 to 1.2 I might use for some more strength, speed, ballistic work as such. But then after that, I'm moving straight down to the strength realm, and I want guys repping in the below 0.5s for the end of set schemes. How does that fit with what you do, and what do you use as your guide and thresholds that the listeners could take away practically?
So again, there's kind of a spectrum with this kind of stuff, and I often get asked what's best practice for VBT, and my political answer is always best practice is whatever fits your environment. So if you're in a position where you can profile, get real targets for that individual, set thresholds and do it that way. That's definitely the best way of doing it. Individualize it, set thresholds based on that data, and do it that way. If, however, you're not in a position to do that, which a lot of S&C coaches aren't, we can go down I think it was Brian Mann's zones that you just described there, and we can be quite blanket with that, and they're fine. They work to a certain extent. I think the happy medium between the profiling and that is to try and find, and there's lots of literature out there now, find some literature in an exercise that's similar or the same to you, and use those thresholds, because typically what you'll find is you'll get from 30 to 100% in 5% increments with specific velocities to focus on, and then you can make some real tangible and objective decisions based on that information. And again, you don't have to go through the rigmarole of profiling, but you can still get that information. Just going back, sorry, just while you mentioned about the kind of the polarized approach, I would definitely advocate that. And I think you're right. There is confusion. I suppose it's a bit like aerobic training, the polarized and the kind of no man's land in the middle. I think it works in a similar way. If you're looking to utilize it for power, go light and fast. Really try and push them into from a mean velocity perspective, above 1, and try and push them on. If it's peak velocity, you might be aiming to get up to 3.5, 4, something like that. And then likewise in the max strength area, you want to be down at sort of 0.5 and below. But I would always try and make that as individualized as you can, if you can.
And I think then the third strategy we wanted to dig into with some practical takeaways for the listeners is this velocity loss. And I think this is probably an area that I've struggled with, because I've just not had somebody telling me, like you're about to now, how to use this specifically and precisely. And I've played around with a few things, 5% drop, 10% drop for power work. Obviously heard about the 20 to 30% velocity loss for strength gains, etc. How are you using it? What would you advise for people to do in the most simplistic way, biggest bang for buck?
Yeah, it's not too dissimilar to that, to be honest, Dan. It's a case of understanding the spectrum of velocity loss. And I think, again, one of my kind of, it's not a bugbear, but it's something that I've recognized within S&C is we are great at individualizing and auto-regulating intensity. But for some reason, we don't seem to do the same with volume. We seem to say, if we're going to work at X percentage, we're going to do, your classic 5x5 at 85% or whatever. Velocity loss for me takes away some of that ambiguity, and it allows us to, again, listen to the neuromuscular systems of the people in front of us and program accordingly. So I think as long as you understand the spectrum, the greater the velocity loss, 35, 40, 45%, the more metabolic muscle adaptations you're going to elicit. So you're going down the hypertrophic type route. And then the smaller the percentage loss, so your 5, 10%, you're very much doing small volumes. It's going to be explosive, and you're probably looking in and around that power impulsive area. You're right, 20 to 30% has been pretty much agreed upon as being the right sort of area for strength gains. But again, there's kind of a bit of a sliding scale there with individual responses.
So if we hone in on that then for the listeners, practically, you're coaching me, I'm on the bench, I've got 100K on the bar and it's moving. Are we looking at first rep velocity and then we're tracking that change? Obviously, there's some mathematics to do there sometimes.
So normally these days there are, in all the apps, it'll do it for you.
Yeah.
So all the decent, the ones that I've come across have a velocity loss setting. So I would always go off best rep. Now, there is a caveat to that. And the reason I say go off best rep is because often...
And best rep of that set or best rep at that weight historically?
Best rep of that set.
Yes. Yeah.
Because typically if you take like a deadlift, for example, are you doing a touch and go type movement, that first one is always going to be slower than the second. So you want to give it the best option to then get the most out of the set. But the caveat of that is they have to be familiarized, habituated with moving with maximal intent, because if you start going up and down within a set, that's going to throw off the velocity loss. But yeah, I would go with best reps, so fastest rep, and then let the technology say when you've cut by 10, 20, 30, 40%. 40%, you're getting close to failure.
And let's say we take that example, 100 kg, we're moving at 0.6 on that first best rep. That's looking at a 1.2 drop off at 20%. Is that right? 4.8 meters per second. Yeah. So you want to see me getting down to 4.8 meters per second in my last reps. Would you be using velocity loss then to say keep going until we get beyond 30%, or how does it prescribe for you?
So I would, again, there's probably two different ways you could do it. You could say, right, I want you to do X amount of sets in this session on this lift. Reps are determined by velocity loss. Or you could say, I want you to do X amount of reps within this session. Sets are determined by velocity loss. The research, albeit not very much on it, suggests the former. So the sets dictating the number of reps is a better option. And that's the option.
Fixed sets, that is.
Yeah. So you might say you're going to do 5 sets. The number of reps is determined by the velocity loss. That's how I would typically use it. And I would simply say, right, if your aim is your 100K, you're lifting at 0.8 or whatever it is, you want to drop by 20%. When you hit that 20% drop off, sets cut, keep the same load, because hopefully what we've done as well is we've done some kind of intensity auto regulation at the start of the session, which means that 100 kg is right for you on that given day. And then we go into the velocity loss for those 3, 4, 5 sets or whatever it is we're doing in that day.
Nice example there. So does it need a specific starting velocity? Can you get it wrong? Like look for a 30% velocity loss, be way too light, and therefore.
Yeah, I've got evidence of that. I've done that myself in terms of worked with individuals that perhaps don't understand their own strength or don't understand just are new to training, and we've aimed for sort of 3, 4 sets of, in my head, should be around 5 to 6, and they're going up, they're in the 20s. Now that's a good educational piece for that individual, because it shows them they're a lot stronger than they think, and actually there should be a hell of a lot more weight on that bar. But yeah, it's a bit of trial and error. It all comes back to understanding your athletes, understanding what they can do, what they can lift, and just trying to track over time. If you get an athlete through the door, you're not just going to stick velocity loss on them and say, right, I'm going to nail it in this session and we're good to go. There's going to be teething problems. There's going to be a bit of exploration to make sure that the starting velocities, as you say, are right, and then the preceding velocity loss works.
Amazing. And if we just wrap up then with the power side of things, which is probably a bit cleaner because we know the intent is there.
Yeah.
Are you looking at using like 5 to 10, or is 5 like a peaking strategy and 10 is an accumulation strategy? I know it's tough for you to say, but these are the questions people have. So it's cool to hear your thoughts.
I would say, so I would probably go, I don't know if I would go much lower than 10%. The only reason I say that is because I think anything lower, you're getting into the muddy waters of what's measurement error and what's actual, true velocity change. And I think 5% is such a small number that I'd be apprehensive. They might do 1 rep or they might do 2 reps or whatever. And then you think, okay, that does fit within power, but then maybe that extra rep, that 3 rep would have done the 10%. And then we're in a slightly better stimulus for that individual. So
I guess if we're using a load that is eliciting a fatigue through reps, then it's probably not in a peaking phase anyway. And so that 10% is probably golden. Awesome. Steve, thank you so much. I know we're going to go into part 2 soon and look at your performance stumbles. I'm really excited to hear that. But thank you so much for digging into 3 key areas very specifically with some real practical insight for everybody who's listening. So thank you so much on behalf of everyone.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.
So a great episode there with a huge number of practical takeaways for Stephen, not just for you as listeners, but for myself as well as a practitioner. I hope you're enjoying the format of the podcast. We'll listen and hear from Steve again next week. But in the meantime, if you've got any feedback, or you can like, comment and share on the podcast and share it to your networks on socials, that's very much appreciated. And I look forward to sharing next week's episode with you.